The morning began the way it always had. A pale ribbon of sunlight slipped through the maple branches, dew gathered quietly along the edges of the grass, and somewhere beyond the fence a northern cardinal released its first clear whistle into the cool air. A blue jay answered from higher in the oak, sharp but familiar, the kind of sound that disappears into the rhythm of an ordinary backyard until one day it doesn't. You stepped outside carrying nothing more than your morning coffee. The feeder was full. The bird bath shimmered without a ripple. A light breeze stirred the leaves just enough to make them whisper. Everything looked exactly as it had yesterday. And yet something felt subtly different. The cardinal landed on its usual branch, no more than 15 feet away. It stayed perfectly still. Its crest caught the morning light, its dark eyes fixed toward the feeder, then toward you. Above it, the blue jay shifted once along the fence rail, gave a quiet call, and waited. Neither bird moved closer. Neither bird left. They simply watched, as though they were hesitating over a decision already made. You may have seen moments like this before without giving them a second thought. Most people do. They assume birds come and go for reasons too small to notice. But sometimes the smallest pauses carry the deepest meaning. If you're new here, consider subscribing before you leave, because what you're about to discover may forever change the way you look at every cardinal, every blue jay, and every quiet morning outside your window. But that is only where this story begins. Because what happened next wasn't louder. It wasn't dramatic. It was quieter than that, and somehow, that made it impossible to ignore. Perhaps you have experienced something like this without ever telling anyone. You refill the feeder with the same care you always have. You rinse the bird bath. You scatter a few fallen leaves away from the stepping stones. Nothing feels different to you. And yet, when you glance toward the branch where the cardinal usually waits, it is empty. Or the blue jay arrives, studies the yard for a long moment, then turns away before touching a single seed. Moments like these are easy to dismiss because they are so ordinary. We tell ourselves the birds are simply busy somewhere else. The weather changed. A hawk passed through earlier. There is always a reasonable explanation waiting to quiet that small feeling in the back of your mind. But that feeling has a way of returning. It comes when the yard seems just a little quieter than yesterday. It comes when the morning chorus feels thinner, even though you cannot explain why. It comes when a bird pauses, looks toward you, and leaves without doing what it has done 100 mornings before. Most people never stay with those moments long enough to notice the pattern. They continue with the day, carrying only the faint impression that something was different. Yet nature often speaks in changes so subtle they can only be recognized by someone willing to slow down. That is what makes these quiet encounters so memorable. They linger long after the coffee has gone cold and the sunlight has climbed higher into the trees. And this is where everything begins to shift, because what appears to be a random habit of two familiar birds may actually be the beginning of a conversation that has been unfolding around you far longer than you realize. The hidden part is not that cardinals and blue jays dislike certain things. The hidden part is how quietly they tell you. They almost never announce a decision in a way that feels dramatic. Instead, they change the smallest details of their routine. A cardinal that once flew directly to the feeder now chooses the branch above it first. A blue jay that used to call loudly from the fence suddenly falls silent before crossing the yard. Nothing about those moments feels important until you begin seeing them together instead of one at a time. Nature rarely speaks through a single event. It speaks through patterns. That is why so many people miss what has been unfolding just outside their windows for months, sometimes even years. The birds are not behaving randomly. They are constantly measuring distance, movement, sound, timing, and consistency. They notice the chair that has been moved a few feet across the patio. They notice the new reflection in a freshly cleaned window. They notice when a gate that is usually closed remains open. Most of all, they notice habits, because habits allow the wild to decide whether a place still feels safe. There is something quietly humbling about that. While we often believe we are the ones observing them, they have been studying the rhythm of our mornings all along. Many people believe intuition begins with the feeling inside us. But perhaps it sometimes begins outside us first, in the living world that notices small changes long before we do. And this is where the story becomes even more intriguing, because once you understand what these familiar birds are actually paying attention to, you begin to realize that some of the things they wish we would stop doing are so ordinary that almost everyone repeats them without ever questioning why. There is a reason those tiny changes matter more than they seem. Researchers have found that many backyard birds build detailed mental maps of the places they trust, remembering not only where food appears but how a place feels from one morning to the next. Blue jays, members of the corvid family, are especially known for recognizing individual people and adjusting their behavior based on repeated experiences. Cardinals may be quieter about it, but they rely just as heavily on routine. They return to familiar feeding areas because familiarity lowers risk. That simple idea changes everything. Imagine walking into your favorite neighborhood every morning only to find that something small has shifted. A chair where there was never a chair. A bright object catching the sunlight. Sudden movement where there was usually stillness. You might continue walking, but perhaps a little more slowly. Birds do much the same. They are not afraid of every change. They simply pause long enough to decide whether yesterday's safe place is still today's safe place. That pause you noticed on the branch was never empty. It was full of quiet calculations happening inside a brain no larger than a walnut, yet remarkably capable of recognizing patterns that most of us overlook. Somehow, knowing the science does not make the moment feel less mysterious. It makes it feel more intimate. Because what appears to us as hesitation is often the visible edge of trust being measured. And trust, whether between people or between a human and a wild bird, is rarely lost all at once. It fades through small moments, repeated often enough to become a pattern, which raises a gentle but unsettling question. If these birds have been watching so carefully, what tiny habits of ours have slowly been changing the way they see us without us ever realizing it? The next morning you find yourself moving a little more slowly. Not because anyone told you to, but because something inside you has started paying attention. The coffee is still warm in your hands. The morning air still carries that familiar scent of damp leaves and fresh earth. But now your eyes drift first toward the branches instead of the feeder. The cardinal is already there. It does not sing immediately. It simply watches as sunlight reaches across the yard one quiet inch at a time. A few moments later, the blue jay appears on the fence, tilting its head with the unmistakable curiosity that has always made it seem as though it knows more than it is willing to reveal. You remain still, almost without realizing it. You lower your shoulders. You stop shifting your weight from one foot to the other. The yard settles with you. A leaf tumbles onto the grass. Somewhere beyond the trees, another bird calls. Then, almost too gently to notice, the cardinal leaves its branch and glides to the feeder. Not hurried. Not fearful. Just calm. The blue jay waits another few seconds before following. It is such a small moment that anyone driving past your house would never think twice about it. Yet something inside you recognizes its importance. Trust is rarely built through grand gestures. It grows from mornings like this, repeated until they become part of someone else's memory. Perhaps that is why these birds begin to feel less like visitors and more like quiet neighbors whose routines slowly intertwine with your own. Many people believe the deepest connections with nature arrive through extraordinary encounters. But more often they are born from ordinary mornings that ask nothing of us except patience, consistency, and the willingness to notice what has always been there. And once you begin noticing, the smallest habits begin carrying a meaning they never seemed to hold before. Days pass, and without meaning to, you begin seeing the yard as the birds do. The morning is no longer measured by the clock on the kitchen wall, but by the moment the cardinal chooses its favorite branch and the blue jay appears from somewhere beyond the trees. Their arrivals are not perfectly predictable, yet they are never careless. They hesitate in different places depending on what has changed. A garden hose left across the lawn. A shiny package resting beside the back door. A ladder leaning where there was only open space yesterday. To you, they are ordinary details that barely deserve a second glance. To them, they rewrite the map. And that is where the quiet mystery grows deeper than most people ever imagine. It is easy to believe that birds simply react to the world around them. But over time, it begins to feel as though they are responding to the story your yard tells every single day. A story written in movement, routine, light, sound, and consistency. Every small choice becomes another sentence they read without words. Many people believe intuition is something we possess alone, hidden somewhere inside the human mind. Yet standing there in the soft morning light, watching two familiar birds pause before making the same careful decision, you cannot help wondering if intuition has always been shared by the living world around us. Perhaps that quiet feeling you sensed on the very first morning was not imagination at all. Perhaps you were noticing the moment their confidence had begun to shift. And if such small changes can reshape the way these birds experience a place they once trusted, then the question becomes impossible to ignore. Which everyday habit, repeated so often it feels invisible, has been speaking to them more loudly than any sound you have ever made? After enough mornings, something inside you becomes quieter. You stop expecting the birds to perform for you, and instead you begin listening to the spaces between their movements. The cardinal lingers on the same branch as the breeze moves through the leaves. The blue jay waits until the yard feels settled before crossing the open grass. Neither action feels extraordinary on its own, yet together they create a rhythm that is difficult to dismiss. Many people believe that every meaningful connection begins with words. Nature seems to suggest otherwise. It begins with repetition, with patience, with trust that grows so gradually, neither side notices the exact moment it appeared. There is something about this that feels difficult to ignore. Not because it proves anything beyond the ordinary, but because it gently reminds us that we are never as separate from the living world as we sometimes imagine. Researchers may describe these behaviors through memory, pattern recognition, and risk assessment. Those explanations matter. They help us understand what we can observe. Yet they do not erase the quiet feeling that settles over a familiar yard when the same birds return day after day, watching, adjusting, remembering. Perhaps both things can be true at once. Perhaps science explains how the behavior happens, while our hearts search for what it means to us. You never have to believe that a cardinal carries a message or that a blue jay arrives for reasons beyond nature. But many people have stood exactly where you are standing now and felt that a simple morning encounter somehow reflected something deeper inside themselves. Whether that feeling comes from intuition, attention, or something we have not yet learned to describe, it has a way of slowing us down. And once you reach that point, the smallest habit in your own daily routine begins to feel far more important than it ever did before, because you start wondering whether the birds have been responding to it all along. One morning, almost without thinking, you leave the yard exactly as you found it. The chair remains where it has always been. The garden tools stay tucked away. You close the gate gently instead of letting it swing. Then you step back and simply wait. Nothing remarkable happens at first. The breeze moves through the oak leaves with the same quiet rhythm. Sunlight settles across the feeder until the metal catches a soft golden glow. A squirrel crosses the far edge of the fence and disappears. The world continues at its own patient pace. Then the cardinal arrives. Not dramatically. Not as a reward. It lands on the familiar branch and begins smoothing a single feather before lifting its head toward the yard. A few moments later, the blue jay follows, its bright colors almost luminous against the morning shadows. There is no sudden revelation, no unmistakable sign that everything has changed. Instead, there is something gentler. The hesitation that once lingered in the air seems just a little lighter. The silence feels less uncertain and more peaceful. Perhaps nothing extraordinary has happened at all. Perhaps you have simply become quiet enough to notice what trust has always looked like. Many people spend years searching for profound moments in nature, waiting for something impossible to happen. Yet the deepest realization often arrives disguised as an ordinary morning that asks for nothing except attention. You begin to understand that the relationship was never built in the dramatic moments. It was built in the countless unnoticed ones. A glance from a branch, a careful landing, a familiar call carried across cool air. Standing there, with the light growing warmer and the yard slowly filling with life, it becomes difficult to separate observation from gratitude. And somehow, that quiet feeling stays with you long after the birds have disappeared into the trees. As the seasons continue, the mornings never become identical, but they begin to feel familiar in a different way. You no longer step outside expecting the birds to prove anything. You simply notice. The cardinal resting for a quiet moment before the first song. The blue jay pausing on the fence until the yard settles into its natural rhythm. The soft movement of leaves that have witnessed thousands of years. You realize the greatest change did not happen in the birds at all. It happened in the way you learned to see them. The smallest choices no longer feel insignificant. A little more patience, a little less hurry, a little more consistency. These simple things quietly reshape the relationship between your world and theirs. Many people believe nature reveals itself only to those searching for extraordinary signs. Yet perhaps its deepest lessons have always arrived through ordinary moments repeated often enough to become meaningful. Whether you see that as instinct, careful observation, or something gently spiritual is a decision only you can make. But something about it remains difficult to forget. Thank you for staying until the very end and sharing these quiet moments with us. If stories like this help you slow down and notice the living world in a new way, consider subscribing before you leave, because there are still countless quiet mysteries waiting just beyond the edge of everyday life, hidden in places most of us pass without ever truly seeing. Until next time, may you find a reason to pause when the morning feels unusually still. And perhaps, somewhere outside your window tomorrow, a familiar pair of wings will settle onto an old branch once again. Maybe it was only a bird, but somehow, it never felt like only a bird.